The year is 1931, and a young woman is standing at the edge of a frozen lake in northern Ontario, barefoot in the snow, because she gave her only pair of boots to a child who had none. Nobody sent her there. Nobody invited her. Nobody knew her name in that town, and nobody would have believed, looking at her, that she had left behind a teaching post at a respected girls' school in Toronto, a promising engagement to a kind man from a good family, and every reasonable future she had been handed, to come to a place that had no roads and no electricity and no interest in what she had to offer. Her name was Harriet Evelyn Cross, and if you have never heard that name, that is exactly the point. This is not the story of a celebrated woman. This is the story of a faithful one. And the difference between those two things is the whole sermon. Harriet was born on September 3, 1899, in Stratford, Ontario, the second daughter of a Presbyterian deacon and a schoolteacher. The house was not wealthy, but it was ordered. There were books on every shelf. There were prayers at every meal. There were expectations, quiet but absolute, about what a girl of her particular intelligence was supposed to do with her life. She was supposed to become a teacher. She did. She was supposed to become a wife. She almost did. What nobody expected, least of all Harriet, was that on a Tuesday evening in March of 1921, she would walk into a small Pentecostal meeting in the back of a hardware store on Erie Street in Stratford, mostly because her friend Doris had asked her 3 times, and she had run out of polite ways to say no. And she would sit in the 3rd row and feel something she had no language for. She described it later, in the journal she kept for the rest of her life, as being like a hand pressed flat against the inside of her chest pushing outward. She did not go back the following week. She was engaged by then to a man named Arthur, who was steady and earnest and utterly baffled by anything that couldn't be explained by reason or committee. She went to her Presbyterian church on Sunday. She marked her students' compositions on Monday. She told herself what she had felt in that hardware store was sentiment, possibly exhaustion. But the hand did not go away. By 1923, the engagement had quietly dissolved. Arthur had said, more than once, that he didn't know who she was becoming. She hadn't known how to tell him that she wasn't sure either, but that she was no longer afraid of the not knowing. She gave her first 2 years to a small mission school 40 minutes north of Sudbury, teaching the children of Finnish miners and Ojibwe families who had been pushed to the edge of the map. The conditions were not romantic. The schoolhouse had a wood stove that worked 3 mornings out of 5. There were weeks in January when the temperature dropped so far below 0 that ink froze in the wells before noon. She ate oatmeal most days. She wrote home to her mother that she had never been happier, and she meant it in a way she couldn't fully explain, which is usually the sign that something is actually true. And then the consumption came. In the winter of 1925, Harriet developed a cough that the local doctor recognized immediately and regarded with the flat professional expression that is worse than any words. Her lungs were compromised. He sent her south to a sanatorium outside Barrie. The prognosis was guarded. Several of her fellow patients did not recover. Here is the thing that Harriet wrote in her journal from that sanatorium bed, a detail that has stayed with everyone who has ever read it. She did not pray to be healed. She prayed to be useful. She wrote, "The healing is his business. The willingness is mine." 9 months later, she walked out of that sanatorium with clear lungs and a conviction so settled it had no more need of argument. Whatever God had kept her for, she was going to find it. She spent the next 3 years in preparation. Not dramatic preparation, invisible preparation. She read everything she could find about the indigenous communities of the Northern Territories. She studied Cree vocabulary from a grammar written by a Methodist missionary in 1882. She fasted, not as a performance, but as a discipline she had come to regard the same way a carpenter regards a good set of tools, not magical but essential. She prayed early, before the house was awake, in the particular silence of pre-dawn that she described as the only hour that belonged entirely to God. She told no one in detail what she was preparing for, because she could not have explained it precisely. She only knew she was going north. In 1928, a letter arrived from a small interdenominational mission organization in Winnipeg, asking if anyone might be willing to go to a remote community on the eastern shore of James Bay, a place where a generator ran for 4 hours a night, and the nearest hospital was a 3-day journey by dog sled in clear weather. The community had a school. The school had no teacher. The letter had been circulating for 7 months without a response. Harriet wrote back the same afternoon. The community was called Moose Crossing, though it appeared on no official map by that name. The people were Cree and Métis, mostly, with a handful of families who had come up from Quebec 3 generations back and stayed for reasons nobody could now fully remember. They had a way of watching newcomers arrive that Harriet described in her journal as the patience of people who have seen too many arrivals become departures. She was not the first outsider to come to that community with good intentions. She would not be the first to be met with something less than welcome. The first winter nearly ended it. The cold was of a different character than anything she had encountered south of the 60th parallel. Not just a matter of temperature, but of totality. Cold that took up residence in your bones and declined to leave. The schoolhouse was a single room heated by a barrel stove. Some mornings 3 children came, some mornings 12. The attendance pattern had nothing to do with enthusiasm, and everything to do with which families had fuel that week, and which did not. She taught anyway. She prayed in the mornings, alone, before the first child arrived. She had brought 2 crates of books from Toronto. By spring, she had given most of them away. There was a woman in the community named Mary, the wife of a trapper, who had not spoken directly to Harriet for the entire first winter. She brought her fish sometimes, left at the door. She did not stay. In March, after a blizzard that kept everyone inside for 11 days, Mary came to Harriet's door, came inside without knocking, sat down at the table, and said in Cree, a sentence that Harriet had to ask her to repeat 3 times before she understood it. What Mary said was, "Why haven't you left yet?" Not as a hostile question, as a genuine one. As the question of a woman who had watched 14 outsiders arrive and leave in 20 years, and who needed to know if this one was different, and why. Harriet did not have a polished answer. She said, in her imperfect Cree, that she did not know how to explain it except that she had been told to come, and she had come, and nobody had told her to go yet. Mary looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was the first time Harriet had heard her laugh. That was the door. Not a miracle in a courtyard. Not a healing that stopped a guard in his tracks. Just a woman who hadn't left, and a question, and a laugh. The doors that God opens are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are simply the door that finally opens because you were still standing there after everyone else had walked away. If you have ever waited at a door that took years to open, comment below with the words, "Still here." We want to hear your story. By 1933, Harriet had learned enough Cree to teach in it, which was a thing no previous teacher at that school had done. The children, who had previously sat in school as if enduring something, began to stay late. Harriet noticed that they learned to ride faster in the language they already held in their mouths. She wrote to the mission organization about it. The mission organization wrote back with a measured response suggesting she not deviate too far from the standard curriculum. She wrote back, respectfully, that she would take that under advisement. She did not change what she was doing. Something else was happening too, alongside the teaching and the Cree lessons and the morning prayers. People were beginning to come to Harriet with things she had not anticipated. A father whose son had not spoken in 3 years following a fever. An elderly man with a pain in his side that had persisted so long he had simply stopped mentioning it. A woman who had lost 4 pregnancies and who came to Harriet not because she expected anything, but because she had run out of other places to bring it. Harriet prayed with each of them, simply, directly, without ceremony. She did not announce healings. She did not build a platform. In most cases, she did not speak publicly about what happened afterward. Her journal, however, was specific. The boy spoke. Not immediately, not that afternoon, but 9 days after the prayer, he said a complete sentence at the breakfast table, and his mother sat down on the floor and wept. The elderly man's pain ceased overnight. The woman who had lost 4 pregnancies carried her next child to full term. She named the girl Grace. Grace was still alive, still in that community, as of the last time anyone looked. Harriet wrote about each of these in the same plain, unflowery way she wrote about everything. The same register she used to describe what she ate for supper or how many cords of wood she had laid in for February. not because she thought the healings were ordinary, but because she thought wonder ought to be quiet. She believed that when you dressed a miracle in too many words, you put yourself in the center of it. She preferred to leave God in the center. She wrote, in a journal entry from January 1935, "I have learned that the moment I begin to explain what God did, I stop being a witness and start being a presenter. I do not want to present God. I want to point to Him." She stayed. That is the fact that is so simple it almost passes you by. She stayed. In 1936, she was offered a position at a mission school in Vancouver. Considerably better conditions. A salary that would have felt like abundance after 7 years of near poverty. She turned it down and wrote in her journal that she felt she had not yet been released from where she was. In 1938, her mother died in Stratford. Harriet could not get south in time for the funeral. She had not seen her mother in 4 years. She wrote a letter that arrived 2 weeks after the burial. She buried the grief, as she described it, in the same place she buried everything she could not afford to carry, which was not suppression. She was careful to say, but entrustment. That distinction matters. Suppression is when you push something down so it can rise again later. Entrustment is when you give it to a hand larger than your own. Harriet had learned the difference through long practice, and it cost her something every time she did it correctly. The war came. Moose Crossing lost 6 of its young men to the overseas regiments. 2 did not come back. 1 came back changed in ways that took years to surface. Harriet wrote to every family, every month, for the duration. She prayed by name, alone in the schoolroom before dawn. She had been there 12 years by now. Her hair, which had been a clear chestnut when she arrived, had gone largely gray. Her hands had the particular roughness of a northern life. She had not worn a dress she would have recognized from her Toronto years in over a decade. There were people in her home congregation in Stratford who had forgotten she existed. There were people in Moose Crossing who could not imagine the community without her. It was around this time, 1940, 1941, that what had been quiet began, in certain circles, to be whispered about. A minister named Calvert, who passed through Moose Crossing on his circuit twice a year, had begun to mention Harriet's name in other communities, not sensationally, not with embellishment, but with the particular tone of a man who has seen something and cannot stop thinking about it. He told a gathering in Timmins that he had watched a woman with no medical training and no public platform pray for the sick in a schoolroom, and that what followed those prayers had no explanation he could locate in his seminary education. People came, not crowds, nothing like Argentina, nothing like stadiums, but people made the journey deliberately, from communities a day or 2 away, asking if they could speak with the teacher at Moose Crossing. Harriet received each of them the same way. She made tea. She asked questions. She prayed when asked. She did not build a schedule around it. She did not let it replace the teaching. She was very clear, in the few letters she wrote about this period, that she was not a healer. She was a school teacher who prayed, and whatever God chose to do with those prayers was entirely His business and not something she was prepared to claim. This is the posture that is almost impossible to maintain under attention. Almost no one gets it right. The attention finds you, and somewhere between the first visitor and the 10th, you begin to feel like you are the common denominator. And from there, it is a very short and very quiet drift toward believing you are the source. Harriet never made that drift. She was vigilant against it in a way that had nothing to do with false modesty and everything to do with a clear-eyed understanding of what she had seen happen to others who had. She wrote, "The day I begin to think the grace belongs to me is the day I become dangerous." She kept the 3 chords, her own version of what Tommy Hicks had called his 3 chords. She didn't know Tommy Hicks, never would, the word, prayer, and what she called ordinary faithfulness, by which she meant doing the daily and undramatic thing with the same care you would give a cathedral, showing up, marking compositions, splitting wood, learning 15 new Cree words a week. These were not the background of her ministry. They were the ministry. She was 53 years old before anyone outside of the James Bay region had heard her name. A journalist from a Toronto church magazine came up in 1952 on assignment for a feature about remote mission work. She gave him an hour of her time, answered his questions plainly, declined to have her photograph taken, and asked him please not to make her sound interesting. The article ran under the headline, "The Teacher Nobody Sent." It was read by more people than Harriet ever knew. Letters arrived from across the country. Women in Hamilton and Calgary and Prince George, who wrote to say that the article had named something they had been trying to articulate for years. The sense of a calling that was not glamorous and not celebrated and not even particularly visible, but that was, nonetheless, real and costly and worth everything. Harriet answered every letter by hand. She wrote to one woman in Edmonton who had asked how she kept going when nothing seemed to be happening. The absence of visible results is not the same as the absence of God. It only feels that way when we have decided in advance what God's presence is supposed to look like. She stayed in Moose Crossing until she was 67 years old, when a fall on the ice in early November left her with a hip that would not heal correctly in the northern cold. The community brought her south by float plane, an event that drew more people to the small airstrip than anything in recent memory. Mary, who was old now and moved slowly, stood at the edge of the group and did not say anything, and did not need to. Harriet spent her last years in a small room in a church home in Barrie, Ontario, the same city where the sanatorium had once housed her, back when she was 25 and her lungs were failing and the doctor had offered her that measured, cautious look. She wrote in her journal until her hands made it difficult. She prayed every morning. She died on February 14, 1971. She was 71 years old. The obituary in the Stratford Beacon Herald ran 4 sentences. The service was attended by 40 people, including a group of Cree women from Moose Crossing who had made the journey south in February, which anyone from the north knows is no small thing. Among them was Grace, the daughter of the woman who had lost 4 pregnancies, named for what had come through. Here is what the obituary did not mention. In the 23 years Harriet Cross taught in Moose Crossing, the school's attendance rate went from 40% to 91%. 14 of her students went on to become teachers themselves. 3 became nurses. 1 became a doctor. The Cree language curriculum she developed informally was eventually adopted, with some modifications, by mission schools in 2 other communities. The number of people she prayed for in that schoolroom, in a private and unannounced way, has never been counted because she never counted them. She left behind 31 journals, a pair of reading glasses, a Bible with so many annotations in the margins that in places you can barely read the original text, and a community that did not hold a single dramatic moment it could point to as the turning point, but that remembered, collectively and with great specificity, a woman who had shown up one winter and simply had not stopped. This is not a story about what God does through the famous. It is not a story about stadiums or headlines or arrival at the seat of power. It is a story about what God does through the available. The gap between Harriet Cross and you is not talent. It is not calling. It is not credentials or confidence or a track record that would impress anyone at a committee meeting. It is one thing only, the willingness to stay at a door that is not yet open. The harvest does not wait for the celebrated. It waits for the faithful. And somewhere, right now, there is a community that does not yet know it is waiting for someone who will show up and simply not leave. Comment below with "still here" if you are that person. This week, before your phone, before your schedule, before the version of the morning that belongs to everyone else, take 30 minutes and sit with the question Harriet wrote in her journal in the winter of 1935. Not what do I want to do for God, but am I willing to stay where He has put me until He says otherwise? The answer to that question is the whole thing. If the story of Harriet Cross has stirred something in you, wait until you hear what God did through a man who could not even speak without stuttering, who was told by his own congregation that he would never stand behind a pulpit, and who became one of the most unmistakable voices in 20th century revival history. What did he discover in a single moment of Holy Ghost authority that rewrote everything he thought he knew about prayer? That story is next.